And the second listener was questioning how on my previous program I labeled a continuum as going between the wealthy and the people, as though the wealthy were not people. He said that the right way to label this continuum would have been between the wealthy on one end of it and the less wealthy or the non-wealthy on the other end of it. And I agree, that makes more sense and is very accurate. Now, the point I was trying to make with that continuum is that a better way of labeling politicians' motivations rather than the familiar left, right, and center based on how much government intervention they want in the economy is whether they're acting to benefit the wealthy more or whether they're acting to benefit ordinary people more. So yeah, wealthy and less wealthy works, but I wrestled with this when I was trying to label the continuum. I didn't want each label to be too big. But what I was concerned about is reinforcing some kind of perception that being in the middle of that continuum, that is the politicians that are trying to help ordinary people but also doing it in a way that doesn't harm the wealthy as much, somehow are acting on the benefit of the broad middle class. That is, if you see on this continuum at one end the very wealthy, the very rich, at the other end is poor, most people are in the middle, right? They're somewhere near the center, according to this way of thinking about it. But that's not so. That's not what I wanted to portray, that, to be on more towards the left end of the spectrum means trying to help the poor necessarily more than everybody else. The Federal Reserve has a lot of statistics on how wealth is distributed in society, and the more recent ones, you'll see, if you look for it online, you'll see a lot of articles based on these figures. So here's a couple of figures that I came across for recent years. For example, the average wealth of a household in the United States is about $747,000. That is, if you take the total wealth of the United States and divide it by the number of households, each of our families would have about $747,000 in wealth. So with $747,000, I can imagine an older couple or a professional couple that has had time to build equity in a home, save a little bit of money, and have a retirement account with some stocks in it. So that's close to $750,000, solidly middle class, I would think. Not filthy rich, certainly not poor, although many of you may be thinking, well, geez, $747,000, I wish I had that much. But if we think, okay, some people are to the left of that, some people are right to that, they have a little more wealth, a little less wealth, that's got to be somewhere in the middle, right? So the majority of people would cluster somewhere near that. Well, not necessarily. In order to determine the midpoint between those who have less and those who have more, you need the median as a measure. Median household wealth is the point at which one half the households have more than that and one half the households have less than that. And that is $122,000. That's about 16% of the average household wealth. So on that continuum from the non-wealthy to the wealthy, well over half the households are way over to the left end of the spectrum. And a lot of them, of course, have negative net worth. That means that they owe more than they own. So majority of the public has less than the average wealth. Now that's why I was concerned that if we have a continuum from the non-wealthy to the less wealthy, people would think most of us are somewhere in the middle and it's the poor that are at the left end. But no, most of us are clustering way over to the left end. So does that mean that the couple that has $747,000 is rich? Well, sounds pretty good to a lot of people, I'm sure, but it's a matter of perspective. According to Forbes magazine, as of November 2020, the top 4 wealthiest people in the United States had each north of $100 billion. That includes Elon Musk with about $188 billion, Jeff Bezos with about $187 billion, Bill Gates with $129 billion, and Mark Zuckerberg, who has $105 billion. $100 billion is about 13,000 times larger than that average household wealth of $747,000. So takes us back to the perspective that these folks are not really rich, not compared to the people who are truly rich. And it means that we have to take our continuum from the non-wealthy to the wealthy and extend the wealthy side far, far, far out to the right, which means, of course, that most of us who are already at the left end of the spectrum look like we're even further left on the spectrum. And that's why I was concerned that if you had that continuum, and I didn't label one end as somehow the collective people or the majority of Americans, it would look like the left end represented the very poor. Well, most of us are not in the middle. We're way to the left, and those on the right are extremely rich. To look at this another way, and again, this is from Federal Reserve statistics, the richest 1% of U.S. households own about 30% of the total wealth in the country. And the richest 10%, including the top 1%, together own about 70% of the wealth in the country, which means that the other 90% of us together own just 30% of the wealth. So 90% of us own as much as the top 1% of us. Okay, there's concentration of wealth. That's what we all know, right? But let's take it a step further. Half of all the households in the United States, that is 50% of the population, owns about 2% of the wealth in the country. So again, this reinforces my point that if you have a continuum from the non-wealthy to the wealthy, the vast majority of the American public is going to be way over on the left end of that spectrum, not somewhere in the right. And it ties into what I said earlier about private property and the free market. The continued concentration of wealth under capitalism, when left to its own momentum, means that a tiny minority of the wealthiest are going to dominate the so-called free market and restrict the benefits of private property to that elite as well. The trajectory of capitalism tends to destroy the very values that we use to justify it.